The moment my dad's voice rose above the music, everything else inside that dining room seemed to freeze. The piano track coming from the speakers, the clinking of glasses, the polite laughter floating between the guests, even the soft hum of conversation from the far end of the table. All of it fell away. What stayed was the sharp, cold edge in his tone as he talked about me like he was a stranger he had already given up on. If you are listening right now, tell me what you are doing. I always love knowing where people are when a story like this finds them, because I remember exactly where I stood when mine cracked open. I remember gripping my plate, the smell of roasted turkey and honeyed ham drifting upward, mixed with the pine scent of the garland running down the center of the table. My fingers tightened so hard around the china that for a second I worried it might slip from my hands. If you are listening right now, tell me what you are doing. I always love knowing where people are when a story like this finds them, because when I look back at that night, everything feels so vivid that sometimes I still hear the room go quiet all over again. My dad stood at the head of the table, surrounded by partners from half the law firms in Philadelphia, people who seemed to admire him almost as much as he admired himself. His face was slightly flushed, a combination of the wine he favored during holidays and the kind of self-importance that made him speak with the confidence of a man who believed he was always right. My mom sat pressed into the chair beside him, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned pale. Madison, my older sister, stared down at her napkin, holding her breath the way she always did when she knew something ugly was coming. He said I had thrown away everything, that I had wasted years of schooling, that I had embarrassed the family, that I had taken every sacrifice he and Mom had made and tossed it aside without a second thought. He made it sound like I was an anchor he had finally decided to cut loose. He painted a picture of me as someone who cared about nothing, as someone who made reckless choices because I enjoyed disappointing him. The words stung, even though I had heard versions of them before, but never like this. Never in a room full of guests, never during Christmas dinner, with candles flickering beside plates and people pausing mid-bite, their eyes darting between him and me. I tried to speak, but the moment I drew a breath, he lifted a hand sharply, as if swatting away an annoying sound. He said I was done embarrassing him. He said I needed to leave the house. He said I should not come back, not until he said it all with a finality that left no space for protest. I felt the words settle into the air like falling ash, burning as they landed. No one moved. No one said my name. I remember waiting for my mom to break her silence, to at least whisper something gentle. I waited for Madison to step forward, to stand between us, to say this had gone too far. But they did nothing. They stayed still, letting his anger decide the outcome. Everyone else at the table pretended to be fascinated by the silverware or the candle, anything that might let them avoid acknowledging the mess unfolding right in front of them. I turned and walked toward the hallway, my legs heavy and my throat tight. I grabbed my coat from the hook near the door, the soft fabric brushing against my shaking hands. The front door opened with a creak that had always annoyed me growing up, but tonight, it felt like the only honest sound in the house, the most sharp and unforgiving, as if the night itself knew I had nowhere to go. Snowflakes drifted under the porch light, catching on my hair and eyelashes. I stood there for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to steady myself, when I heard him again. His voice carried through the slightly open dining room window, softer now, almost mournful. He was telling his colleagues that I had broken the family's heart for a boy, that I had walked away from everything they gave me because I was infatuated with someone who was not good for me, that Mom and he had tried their best but could not reach me, could not convince me to stay on the right path. That lie hit harder than his anger. He made it sound like he had watched me drift away despite his best efforts, that he was a wounded dad doing his best to save a daughter who had chosen the wrong road. I could hear the sympathetic murmurs from guests who had never questioned his hero narrative. I knew that story would spread through their social circles within hours. I knew that in their eyes, I had just become the girl who ran off for love and left her respectable family heartbroken. I wanted to scream that none of it was true, that he pushed me out because I refused to become the lawyer he demanded I become. that he could not tolerate the idea of me studying architecture because it was not prestigious enough, that everything he cared about revolved around how I reflected on him, not who I truly was. Instead, I walked down the steps, my boots sinking into the fresh snow. Each breath felt heavier than the last. I made it to my car, an old sedan with chipped paint and a heater that worked only half the time. When I slid into the driver's seat, the upholstery was freezing against my skin. I sat for a moment with my hands wrapped around the steering wheel, staring at the house glowing behind me like some warm sanctuary I no longer belonged to. The heater sputtered to life when I turned the key. I held my breath, waiting for the vents to push out warm air, but the cold lingered, fogging the windshield with my own exhale. Tears burned the back of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I did not want to cry here. Crying felt like giving him another victory. I backed out of the driveway, slowly, the tires crunching over the snow that had begun to settle into thick patches along the sidewalk. I looked once at the house, at the bright windows and the silhouettes moving inside. They looked like figures in a snow globe, safe and untouchable, sealed in a world where I no longer existed. I drove toward the city. Streetlights cast warm halos on the snow, turning every block into a small, glowing island. Holiday decorations still hung from lampposts, their colors blurred as I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I passed groups of people walking with shopping bags, couples holding hands, families loading gifts into their cars. All of them looked happy. All of them looked like they belonged somewhere. I kept driving, letting the familiar parts of Philadelphia fade behind me. The neighborhoods changed. Then the buildings thinned out as I neared the industrial district by the Black River. I parked behind an old warehouse whose brick walls were cracked and covered in faded graffiti. It was the kind of place no one would look twice at, perfect for someone who did not want to be seen. The heater finally began blowing warm air, weak at first, then steady. I held my numb hands in front of it and breathed deeply. The silence inside the car settled around me like thick fog. But inside that quiet, something strange happened. My mind stopped racing. My breathing slowed, and for the first time since leaving the house, I allowed myself to feel everything at once. Anger, shame, heartbreak, loneliness. A faint, trembling thread of relief I could not explain. I thought about the years leading up to this night. The arguments, the pressure, the unspoken rules of being the daughter of Richard Potter, how I had to pretend to be someone he could show off, someone he could brag about, how I changed my classes to please him, sat in debate clubs I despised, shadowed lawyers I had no interest in becoming, how every time I mentioned art or design or architecture, he shut it down with cold disapproval. Tonight, however painful, had ended something I had not known how to end myself. But endings leave empty space. An empty space is terrifying when you have no map, no safety net, no one waiting for you. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let the warmth of the heater wash over me. Snow tapped gently against the windshield in soft, steady rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, the faint whistle of a train echoed through the night. A gust of wind rocked the car slightly, reminding me how small I was compared to the world around me. I did not know what to do next. I had no plan. My belongings were still in my parents' house. My classes at community college were halfway through the winter term. I had no idea if I could continue them, no idea where I would sleep tomorrow or the day after. But I did know this. I had survived the worst humiliation of my life, and I was still breathing. That felt like something. I wrapped myself in my coat and closed my eyes. The darkness behind my eyelids was softer than the darkness outside. I let my mind drift back to the moment on the porch, to the way the light had caught the snowflakes as they fell around me, each one cold, but strangely peaceful. I imagined collecting them in my hands, letting them melt slowly, one by one, as if their quiet disappearance could wash away what had happened. Hours passed without me realizing. The night shifted from deep black to pale blue. The first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, earning the clouds into faint watercolors. The world outside my car began to stir, small reminders that life kept moving, even when mine felt stuck. I watched the light change, and felt something inside me shift with it. A small voice whispered that maybe losing that house meant I had just been given permission to build a different life. A life that was mine, not his. A life that did not shrink under someone else's expectations. I did not know then that this night would lead me toward mentors, toward opportunities, toward a path that finally felt like my own. I did not know that 5 years later, I would walk into a retirement party with evidence that would shatter the powerful image my dad spent decades building. I did not know that truth has a way of coming back, even when people bury it deep. All I knew was that I was alone, in a quiet city waking up beneath a pale sky, with a chance to become someone different. I took a long breath and let it out slowly, watching it fog the air before fading into nothing. Sometimes the end of a story starts with a door closing softly behind you, and sometimes the beginning of a new one starts in a cold car behind an abandoned warehouse, where the silence finally feels honest. I straightened in my seat, wiped my face, and told myself that no matter how hard this night had been, it would not be the night that defined me. Not anymore. I woke the next morning with a stiff neck, my cheek pressed against the cold window of my car. The light creeping through the cracked glass looked thin and winter blue, the kind of light that usually meant Christmas decorations and warm kitchens. For me, it only meant another day of trying to figure out how to start a life from nothing. The cold seeped through my coat when I sat up, and for a moment, I could not tell if the shaking in my hands was from the temperature or from fear of what the day would bring. I rubbed my eyes and reminded myself that anything had to be better than staying in that house, pretending everything was fine. I had told myself that many times the night before, but it was harder to believe when daylight hit, and all I had to show for my resolve was an old car parked behind a laundromat in West Philadelphia. I turned on the engine so the heater could limp back to life. The air sputtered out in bursts and then finally warmed. I pulled my backpack onto my lap and opened it. Sketchbook, laptop, a few pencils and pens, my wallet, a half-eaten granola bar. My life had been reduced to those items and whatever I could carry on my back. I left the parking lot and walked toward the same small coffee shop from the other day before. My hair was a mess, and my eyes looked swollen in the bathroom mirror as I washed my face and ran my fingers through my hair to make it look presentable. I bought another plain coffee because it was all I could afford, and settled into the corner table again. Someone had left the local newspaper folded open on a nearby chair, and I glanced at the headlines while my laptop warmed up. None of it mattered to me. The world kept moving, even as mine had paused. I opened my email and tried again. I sent messages to firms I had not yet contacted, attaching samples of my sketches and explaining that I was passionate about architecture and eager to learn. I kept my messages short, polite, and hopeful. I stared at the screen, waiting for a miracle while the minutes dragged by. Eventually, the replies came. One firm wrote that they had filled their internship slots earlier in the year. Another wrote that my portfolio seemed interesting, but they had decided to focus on candidates with more studio experience. A third firm responded with a short note saying they were restructuring and not taking on any trainees at the moment. I tried not to let the sting show, but each rejection chipped at me, little by little. None of the messages were cruel. In fact, most of them sounded almost apologetic. That somehow made it worse. Polite disappointment felt heavier than outright dismissal, as if they were gently pushing me aside and hoping I would not push back. By mid-afternoon, my head ached. I walked out of the coffee shop and down the block, letting the air numb my face. The sidewalks were wet with melting snow. People rushed past me carrying shopping bags or chatting into their phones. No one looked at me long enough to see the exhaustion in my shoulders or the uncertainty in my steps. I wandered into a small park and sat on a bench. A few kids were playing nearby, their bright jackets standing out against the pale winter light. Their laughter rang through the cold air, and for a moment, it reminded me of easier times in my childhood before. Expectations became weapons in my family. I pulled out my sketchbook without thinking and began to draw the corner of the way the bare branches stretched toward the sky, and the way the old bench fought against the weight of time. Drawing calmed me. It always had. The world quieted when I let the pencil move. My breathing slowed. My thoughts aligned. Even though my life had fallen apart, the lines on the page still obeyed me. Still made sense. When my fingers grew too numb to continue, I closed the sketchbook and headed back to my car. It felt strange to realize how quickly the sedan had become my shelter. I curled up again in the back seat, covered myself with my coat, and tried to sleep. But my stomach growled loudly enough to keep me awake. I dug through my bag and found the rest of the granola bar. It was stale, but better than nothing. The next morning brought more of the same. I woke up in the car, went to the coffee shop, washed up, ordered the cheapest item on the menu, and sent more emails. I checked message boards and job listings. I asked around online about any volunteer architectural programs or studios, looking for help. The responses were scattered and unhelpful. Some links were outdated. Others led to internships that required enrollment in a design program or at least recommendations from professors. I kept going. It felt like pushing myself through thick mud, slow and exhausting. Every rejection added to the fog of doubt settling over me. My dad had used humiliation like a tool, but now the world seemed to be reinforcing his message, quietly echoing his belief that I was not good enough, not trained enough, not worthy enough. I tried to ignore those thoughts. I reminded myself of every hour I had spent studying design principles, every sketch I had worked on late into the night, every building I had visited just to study its form. Passion has always driven me, but passion did not pay bills or open doors in a field built on connections and credentials. By late afternoon, my eyes burned from staring at my screen. I closed the laptop and walked without destination until I found myself at the free library on Walnut Street again. The warmth inside the building wrapped around me the moment I walked through the door. People chatted quietly in the corners, turning pages or typing on laptops. I headed toward a long table near the window and sat down with my sketchbook. I opened a blank page and let the pencil wander. I sketched rooftops and fire escapes, then doorways and sets of stairs, then shadows stretching across sidewalks. The drawings were loose, almost frantic, but they felt alive. They felt like me trying to make sense of the world. I did not notice anyone watching until an older man stepped closer to me. Table. He had white hair, wire-framed glasses, and a coat that looked older than I was. He introduced himself in a gentle tone as Jeremy Woods. I recognized the name. He had written articles on design theory that I had read years ago in class. Seeing him in person felt surreal. He asked if the sketchbook was mine. I nodded and slid it toward him. He studied the drawings with a kind of seriousness that made my stomach twist. I braced myself for criticism, expecting him to tell me all the ways my lines were wrong, or the composition, too amateur. Instead, he nodded slowly. He said my drawings had intention, that they felt observational rather than decorative. He said that I had captured life in movement, not in stillness. He asked where I had studied. I explained that I had attended community college for general courses, but had not yet enrolled in a design school. He asked if I planned to pursue architecture further. I hesitated. I did not want to admit that I was currently homeless or that my dad had cast me out for choosing a different path than the one he had built his reputation on. Jeremy watched my expression shift and waited patiently. There was no judgment in his eyes, and something about that made it easier to speak. I told him pieces of the truth. I said I had hoped to apply to a design program, but circumstances had changed. I said I was trying to get experience, but had been turned down repeatedly. I said I was not sure what to do next. He closed my sketchbook gently, almost with reverence. He said that one setback did not define a designer. He said that the field needed people who could see beauty in unexpected places. He said that education mattered, but not nearly as much as instinct. And dedication. He said that if I wanted a chance, he would help me. He told me he had a friend who owned a small architecture studio in the city. It was not glamorous or large, but the owner sometimes took on unpaid interns who needed a start. He said that if I sent him my portfolio, he would gladly recommend me. He also said that if I wanted to apply to the University of Pennsylvania design program, he would help me refine my portfolio and write a strong letter. His generosity stunned me. It felt like someone had cracked open a window in a room I thought I was trapped in. He handed me a slip of paper with his email. His handwriting was neat and careful. He told me to send him my portfolio tonight. After he left, I stared at the paper for a long moment. The warmth I felt earlier grew into something stronger. Hope, tentative, trembling, real. I hurried back to my car and opened my laptop. The cold made my fingers stiff, but I scanned and arranged my drawings, compiled them into a clean digital folder. I wrote a message thanking him and attached the files. I held my breath as I clicked send. The next 2 days stretched slowly. I checked my email constantly. Each hour that passed without a response made doubt crawl up my spine. I tried to stay busy sketching and applying for other opportunities. I tried to remind myself that waiting did not mean failure. On the third night, exhaustion made my eyes heavy. I was sitting in the driver's seat, my laptop open, considering once again the idea of selling it. I had looked up a pawn shop earlier that day and had even walked past it. I could not make myself go in. I knew that without the laptop, my chances of rebuilding anything would shrink dramatically. My laptop screen dimmed slightly, and then a notification appeared in the corner, an email from the University of Pennsylvania. My heart stopped for a moment. Then I opened it, afraid to breathe. The message said I had been awarded scholarship assistance. Half of the tuition would be covered if I completed the application process, presented a strong portfolio, and committed to the program. Half. Not all, but half was more than I had ever hoped for. It meant the door was open, not wide, but enough for me to step through. I leaned back in the seat, letting the relief wash over me. My chest felt warm in a way it had not felt since before Christmas. I did not have everything I needed, but I finally had something. And sometimes, something was enough to start again. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without crying. My car felt less like a cage and more like a cocoon. I knew the road ahead would be hard. I knew that my dad would never understand. But I also knew that this chance was mine and no one else's. And I was not going to let it slip. The morning after I received the conditional scholarship notification, I woke in my small rented room on Spruce Street with a feeling I had not had in a long time. The light through the thin curtains felt different, warmer somehow, even though winter still wrapped the city in cold silence. I lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds from the market downstairs and letting the truth settle. I had a place to sleep. I had a mentor. I had a direction that was mine and not shaped by my dad's demands. The scholarship email had been clear. It was not a guarantee of acceptance. It was a notice that my initial application materials showed potential, and that I qualified for a merit-based review that could lead to significant assistance. I still had to complete the full submission, refine my portfolio, and prepare for a final interview if they invited me. But it was something solid, something that felt like a hand reaching through the dark and pulling me toward a future I had only dared imagine. I pushed myself out of bed and dressed quickly. The heater rattled between bursts of warm air, and I held my hands near the vent for a moment to warm them before heading outside. The cold bit at my cheeks as I walked toward Watson and Hale Design, the small architecture studio Jeremy had connected me with. My breath rose in the morning air in little white clouds. Inside the studio, the warmth of creativity greeted me instantly. The smell of coffee mingled with the scent of fresh paper and ink. Henry, the owner, nodded at me from his desk. He had a way of speaking with his eyes more than his words, and his quiet nod meant, "Welcome back." I still felt like an outsider sometimes, but every small gesture from him helped chip away at that fear. I took my seat at the small desk he had set aside for me. A new stack of practice exercises waited there, along with some sketches from the previous day that Henry had marked with soft pencil notes. Nothing harsh, just gentle direction. He circled areas where lines wavered and arrows where proportions needed improvement. Seeing his handwritten guidance made me want to work harder. The morning slid into afternoon as I practiced technical drawings, slow understanding how to translate ideas into precise lines. My hands moved steadily across the paper, each stroke becoming more intentional. I felt the quiet satisfaction of improvement with each page filled. I had always drawn from intuition, but now I was learning structure, discipline, and the language of architecture. By midday, I left the studio and walked a few blocks to the small coffee shop where I worked part-time. The shop sat at the corner of 43rd Street with mismatched chairs and a vintage-looking counter that had probably been there since the 70s. The manager, a woman named Carla, liked people who showed up on time and did not complain, and she trusted me quickly. The job was simple but steady. It paid my rent and allowed me to put a little money aside for application, fees, and art supplies. When the shop was slow, I practiced quick sketches on napkins or in my small notebook. Customers sometimes glanced at the drawings and smiled at me in that polite, distant way people do when they want to show interest but not commit to conversation. I did not mind. I liked being invisible there. It was a different kind of invisibility than what I had felt in my own family. This invisibility was quiet and peaceful, not sharp or diminishing. A few days into this new routine, Jeremy stopped by the studio. He walked in with the ease of someone who had spent decades navigating creative spaces. His coat looked heavier than usual, and his cheeks were flushed from the cold. He greeted everyone in the room, then motioned for me to join him at the table near the window. He asked about my progress with the UPENN application. I told him I had gathered the recommendation letters and collected older sketches from the months before everything fell apart with my dad. He nodded and asked to see my portfolio again. I handed him my laptop, and he scrolled slowly, his eyes moving carefully over each image. He paused on a drawing of a building in West Philadelphia I had sketched during my first week sleeping in the car. The lines were rough, but carried emotion. He asked me what I had been thinking when I drew it. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell him the truth. I said I had drawn it because the shapes of the building made me feel grounded, at a time when I felt completely untethered. He nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to him in a way words often fail to capture. He told me that every architect needed both structure and soul, and that my strength lay in the way I observed life and translated it onto the page. He encouraged me to continue refining my portfolio and to include pieces that held the weight of lived experience, not just technical precision. I spent that evening reorganizing my application materials in the small room on Spruce Street. I laid everything out on the desk: sketches, statements, notes. I sifted through memories as I worked, remembering each drawing and where I had been emotionally when I made it. Jeremy's voice lingered in my mind, reminding me that authenticity mattered. As I organized, a flashback surfaced, uninvited but vivid. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting in my dad's study with books stacked everywhere. He had placed a thick case law textbook in front of me for a debate assignment I never wanted. He had insisted that I learn the structure of arguments because he believed it would make me a lawyer one day. I had tried to understand it, but the language felt foreign and cold. I remembered the disappointment in his eyes when I stumbled through my presentation later that week. Another memory surfaced. I was 16, and my debate team had just lost a regional competition. My dad had pulled me aside afterward. I could still recall the way his lips tightened as he said I did not have the mind for this, and that he expected more because Madison had won her category. I had looked over at my sister then, her smile glowing under the praise of everyone in the room. People loved her confidence. They admired her clarity, her tone, her perfect delivery. She fit the world he wanted so effortlessly, and I had never felt smaller. That memory brought a sting of old hurt, but I pushed it aside because I was not that girl anymore, the one who let her worth be measured beside someone else. I had found a new environment where my strengths mattered, where people saw something different in me. A week later, Jeremy invited me to meet him at the Free Library. He wanted to review the final draft of my UPENN portfolio. He sat across from me at the long wooden table and spread my printed pages between us. I watched him evaluate my drawings with the same serious attention my dad had once given to legal documents. That parallel shook me a little, but then Jeremy smiled gently at one of the sketches and said it captured life in a way he rarely saw in portfolio submissions. He said the admissions committee would recognize something honest in my work. He encouraged me to write from that same sincerity in my personal statement, not from a place of trying to prove my worth to anyone. He said the right people would understand who I was becoming. I spent 3 nights rewriting my statement. I wrote about losing direction. I wrote about rediscovering it in the middle of hardship. I wrote about architecture not as a profession I wanted to pursue for prestige, but as a way of making sense of environments and giving form to emotion. I wrote about hope, about fear, about resilience. And I meant every word. When I finally submitted the entire application packet, I felt a deep exhale escape my body. Everything after that was outside my control. Life continued in its steady rhythm. At the studio, Henry began giving me slightly more complicated tasks. Nothing major, but he trusted me with more sketches and early design drafts. Sometimes he asked for my opinion on materials or layout. And even though he made the final decisions, hearing him ask what I thought made me feel part of something meaningful. At the coffee shop, customers came and went. Some recognized me from previous shifts and offered small smiles or quick greetings. I learned to find quiet joy in predictable routines. Cleaning the espresso machine, stocking napkins, watching the sun shift through the windows as the day changed. But underneath it all, anticipation simmered. I waited for the next step from UPENN. My phone became something I checked too often. Each time I heard a buzz or a ping, my heart lifted. Each time it was something ordinary. A small weight pressed down again. Then, one afternoon at the studio, Henry called me over. He held a printout of a drawing I had submitted earlier in the week for practice. It was a site plan layout, one of the more challenging exercises I had attempted. He told me I had shown clear improvement and that he was impressed with the way I translated spatial understanding onto paper. He said my lines were growing more confident, my decisions more intentional. His quiet praise settled inside me like warm light. It was not loud or flashy, but it meant something. It felt like the first real acknowledgement from inside the industry. That night, when I returned to my room, I saw an email waiting for me. It was from my community college. The semester grades were posted. I opened the message, expecting the usual mix of average results. Instead, my GPA shone bright on the screen. It was higher than it had ever been, reflecting not just effort, but passion. Classes that once felt like obstacles had become stepping stones. Subjects that had confused me in the past now made sense, because I could connect them to something I loved. I sat at my desk, my hands covering my mouth as emotion washed over me. No one was there to see it, no one to validate it, but I did not need validation anymore. I knew what it meant. It meant that the version of myself my dad had always insisted I no longer be existed. The girl who could not keep up. The girl who was disappointed. The girl who would never leave his shadow. That night, I allowed myself to feel proud. I placed the grade report beside my laptop and sat on the edge of my bed, letting the quiet room hold me. The heater clicked softly. The market downstairs buzzed faintly, and everything felt possible. I did not know when UPENN would respond. I did not know if the scholarship would solidify into something more, but I knew, without any doubt, that I was not the same girl who had been pushed out of her childhood home on Christmas night. I was building something new, something strong, something that belonged to me. And I was only getting started. I told myself I would only rest for a few minutes, yet when I opened my eyes again, the sun was already sliding behind the tall buildings across the street. The glow from the window stretched across the small room I rented near campus, warmed the side of my face. 3 years had passed since the night I slept in my car outside the grocery store. 3 years of classes, papers, late-night design revisions, critiques, part-time jobs, and hours spent with Professor Jeremy Woods guiding me through foundations that I never imagined I could master. I always thought I was behind everyone else, running up a hill barefoot, trying to catch students who had prep school portfolios and parents who funded their summer design programs. But somehow I kept climbing. By the time I graduated, I was 26 and carrying a degree from the design school that I once believed was far beyond my reach. I remember feeling almost lightheaded as I walked across the stage in my black gown. Hearing my name called by the dean, I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, as if the world had opened anew, a path that did not exist before. My parents were not there. My sister was not there. The empty chairs where they would have sat if we had been a normal family made my chest ache for a moment. But that ache faded the second I stepped off the stage and saw Professor Woods, waiting at the edge of the crowd. He looked proud and tired, and a little teary, and he pressed my hand gently like a grandfather would. He told me that the world was wide enough for me to shape something in it. I clung to that sentence when everything else felt uncertain. 2 months later, I received an offer from Archer & Bloom architecture firm in Philadelphia. The senior architect wrote that my portfolio stood out for its clarity and restraint, something she claimed was rare in younger graduates. I reread that message so many times that the words blurred. When I accepted the offer, I packed my room within a day and moved into a small studio in South Philadelphia with creaking floors and a narrow window that faced a brick alley. It felt like a palace. It felt like proof. My first day at Archer & Bloom was equal parts nerves and hope. The office was on the 8th floor of a restored factory building. All open beams, glass partitions, rolling carts full of plans, and the kind of quiet hum that made everyone look like they were always in them. In the middle of an important idea, I arrived early, clutching a notebook and pretending that my heart was not pounding. A tall man approached my desk with a wide, easy smile. He introduced himself as Ben Walker and said he would help me get settled. I felt instantly relieved. He seemed to be one of those rare coworkers who eased tension without forcing anything. During lunch, he told me that everyone here had worked their way up, that the firm valued grit more than lineage. I nodded quietly, hiding the relief that washed through me. For so long, my life had been shaped by a dad who believed that only one type of mind deserved success. Being here, among people who built themselves with their own hands, felt like stepping into clean air. Weeks passed. I learned to move through the office with more confidence. I took on small assignments. I double and triple checked my work before submitting anything. I stayed late many nights, studying details on past projects. Sometimes I would look around and realize how far I had traveled from the girl who slept in her car. One morning in early September, the senior architect called me into her glass-walled office. She spoke calmly, telling me the firm was starting a new audit project for a major law company in Center City called Carter & Wells. She said the job involved reviewing their plans for a large renovation of their primary office building. My task would be to help the team gather documents, organize old plans, compare cost projection, and flag anything that looked inconsistent before structural engineers stepped in. I wrote everything down with careful concentration. The name Carter & Wells meant nothing to me. I had heard Dad mention so many firms throughout my childhood that most of them blurred together. He had spent decades building his reputation in the legal world, but I never paid attention to the specific companies he worked with. I simply assumed this was another large client that needed a polished redesign. For the first few days, the work seemed straightforward. I sorted floor plans, examined digital files, and read through meeting logs from previous years. Sometimes Ben stopped by my desk and asked if I had questions. I usually said no, even when I was unsure, wanting to prove myself. But he watched me with a gentle awareness. And occasionally he leaned over and explained something quietly in a way that helped, without making me feel small. One afternoon, I was assigned a packet of documents that had been collected from earlier phases of the law firm's renovation. The pages looked older, printed on thicker paper with fading ink. As I flipped through them, I noticed a signature near the bottom of one of the approval pages. My eyes froze. The handwriting looked painfully familiar, looping and sharp. The same shape I used when signing my name for school forms. I stared again. It was my name. Not just my name typed on the line, but my signature. My exact signature. I felt my breath catch in my throat. For a moment, I wondered if it was a coincidence. If someone else in the world had the same name and the same odd loop I made at. The end of the letters. But deep down, I knew better. That particular shape was something I had done since middle school. I rubbed my thumb across the ink, feeling a cold ripple spread from my neck to my shoulders. I flipped to the next paper, another page with my name printed under an approval section. I traced the letters quietly. My mind raced as I tried to understand how anything from this firm could contain my name. I had never worked with them. I had never signed anything related to a renovation project before I joined. Archer & Bloom. Why would anyone use my name? Why would my signature appear on documents that predated my employment? I sat there, whispering questions to myself, trying to breathe. I remembered the night my dad told me that I had thrown my future away. I remembered the way he used to lecture me about responsibility, legality, image, and integrity. And now, here I was, staring at something that made no sense. I carried the folder to the small conference room near the back of the office and closed the door. The silence only made the pounding in my chest louder. I sat down and read every page, line by line. On some documents, my name was typed. On others, it looked handwritten. The project dates were nearly a year before I started working at Archer and Bloom. The more I read, the more something dark curled in my stomach. Someone had used my identity without my knowledge. Someone who had access to my signature. Someone who knew how to imitate it. Or someone who literally had old documents with my handwriting on them. That list was short. Very short. I leaned back in the chair, pressed my palms against my forehead, and tried to make sense of the growing dread. The renovation approval file included a section with older legal paperwork attached. Papers from a law office. Papers that required authorization signatures from a project liaison. Again, my name appeared. I pushed away from the table and stood up, pacing slowly. My mind instantly jumped to the one person who had always controlled everything tied to my name. Dad. The thought came with both clarity and disbelief. Why would he use my name? Why would he put my identity on paperwork connected to a project like this? What reason could he possibly have? I sat again and forced myself to read further. A set of spreadsheets was clipped near the back. They detailed cost projections, vendor payments, and materials ordered for earlier phases of the building update. Most of the numbers aligned with architectural budgets I had learned to analyze over the past year. But one line stopped me cold. There was a transfer of $480,000. The memo field only said, discretionary allocation pending review. The column for evidence of approval included a scanned note. On the approval signature line, clear as day, was the name Madison Potter. My sister. The room felt suddenly smaller. My ears buzzed as if someone had shut the air off. The file said discretionary allocation, but nothing in the surrounding pages justified a number that large. $480,000 was not petty cash. It was not a rounding error. It was the size of a payment that needed justification, oversight, and transparency. But there was none. The spreadsheet entry was the only place where the number existed. No explanation, no vendor, no invoice, no trail. My hands trembled as I pulled my notebook closer and wrote everything down. Every page number, every signature, every oddity. The competing emotions inside me twisted so sharply that I had to sit, perfectly still, to keep from shaking. There was confusion, anger, fear, and a creeping understanding that chilled me to the bone. Someone used my name for a renovation approval. Someone tied Madison to a massive, unexplained payment. And both sets of documents connected directly to the law firm where Dad held influence. My chest tightened as if a heavy weight pressed down on it. I tried to imagine each possibility, and none felt harmless. The only thing that made sense was that someone at Carter & Wells had been using the names of family members for internal approvals. But that was absurd. That was illegal. That was reckless. And Dad had always cared about his career more than anything else. He would never risk it. Unless something drove him there. Unless he believed he would never be caught. I closed the folder slowly and pressed my fingers against the cover. A thought rose quietly inside me. A thought I did not want to believe. What if the signatures were not forged? What if my dad had access to documents with my handwriting from older school or legal forms? What if he had scanned or copied them? What if he used them himself for reasons I could not yet see? Another thought followed right behind it. What if Madison was not completely innocent? She had always followed Dad closely, trying to earn his approval. She worked in his world, the legal world, the one he claimed was built for people who mattered. Could she have signed something without understanding its purpose? Could she have trusted him too much? Or could she have knowingly stepped into something dangerous because Dad asked her to? I pressed my hands against my eyes, willing my breath to slow. I needed to think clearly. I needed to understand what I was holding. I needed to talk to someone. But who? I could not go to my family. I could not risk exposing my fear to my coworkers. Ben was kind, but this was bigger than casual help. And the senior architect needed clean facts, not my panic. I gathered the documents into the folder again, stacking them carefully. Then I sat there, staring at the wall, listening to my own heartbeat. I felt the same chill I felt the night I stood outside my parents' house in the morgue. Snow, after my dad told me to leave forever. That night, I felt like I had lost my identity. And now, holding these papers, it felt like someone had taken my identity in a very different way, using it for reasons I did not yet understand. The sun outside had shifted again, and the room was slowly darkening with long stripes of shadow. I knew I needed to report the inconsistencies to the senior architect, but not yet. I would not walk into that conversation unprepared. I needed more information. I needed to understand every detail inside this file. And I needed to figure out why my family's names were tangled inside a renovation project that should have had nothing to do with us. I pressed the folder against my chest for a moment, trying to steady myself. I remembered sitting in the small studio apartment during my first year at the APSET design school, staring at the scholarship letter that saved me. I remembered the weight of the laptop in my lap that night, the exhaustion in my bones, and the way hope had pushed itself into my life even when I thought it was gone. I held on to that memory now. I needed the same stubborn faith. The office outside the conference room was quiet. People were finishing their tasks and packing their bags. I breathed slowly, trying to collect myself before stepping into the hallway. I knew that whatever was happening in that folder was only the beginning, and I knew that uncovering the truth might ruin everything I had rebuilt. I touched the cover again and felt a strange sense of determination take hold inside me. Then I opened the door and stepped into the fading light of the office, carrying secrets that would change everything I thought I knew. And that was where the next chapter of this story began. I stepped into the evening air with the folder pressed flat inside my bag, the weight of it feeling heavier than anything I had carried in years. I walked toward the train station with slow, deliberate steps, watching the headlights blur on the wet pavement. The city sounded distant, almost muffled, as if my mind had placed cotton around every noise so I could focus on the storm inside me. I knew I could not face whatever this was alone. There was only one person I trusted with something this serious. Rachel. She had been my friend in college, a brilliant mind who had gone straight into law school, while I fell apart and vanished from that world. We had reconnected online a little during my years at the design program, but only lightly. She had always made it clear that if I ever needed legal guidance, I could reach out. I pulled my phone from my pocket and typed quickly, telling her that I needed to talk and that it was important. For a moment, I feared she might not respond. But within minutes, she wrote back, suggesting we meet at a quiet bar near Rittenhouse Square that she used for client consultations. I made my way there, even though my stomach felt tight with dread. The bar was small, warm, and dimly lit, with heavy dark wood everywhere, and soft music playing low enough that faded into the background. Rachel was already seated in a corner booth, her brown hair tucked behind her ears, her expression calm and focused, the way it always had been when she prepared for something serious. When she saw me walk in, she gave a small nod as if confirming something she already suspected. I slid into the seat across from her and placed the folder on the table, without speaking. She rested her hand on top of it for a moment, then pulled it open. I sat in silence as she read. Her eyes moved slowly, carefully, with the kind of measured attention that came from years of studying contracts and legal frameworks. She flipped pages with a steady rhythm, her face barely changing until she reached the spreadsheet with the $180,000 allocation. She froze. Her jaw tightened slightly, and then she continued reading. When she reached the pages showing signatures under my name, she paused again and exhaled through her nose. After nearly 20 minutes, she closed the folder neatly and looked at me with a seriousness that made my pulse quicken. She spoke quietly and without emotion. She said that what I had shown her contained more red flags than she expected. In her professional opinion, she believed there were clear signs of a slush fund, possibly illegal. She said the unexplained allocation for nearly $500,000 had no business existing without supporting documents. She said the use of family names on internal paperwork was disturbing. She believed someone in that law firm created layers of signatures to make approvals appear legitimate. She suspected that Madison might have been tricked into signing things she did not understand. And then she paused when she said my name. She explained that my identity appeared to be used as a consultant who supposedly gave oversight, even though I had never been affiliated with them. She looked at me steadily and said something even heavier. She explained that if someone used my name knowingly, that was identity misuse. If that person was my dad, the implications were worse. She told me that in cases like this, people often create a family story to distract from real conflicts, to prevent outsiders from asking why a daughter and a dad had a falling out. She suggested that the narrative my family had been telling others about me, abandoning them for some boy, might be a diversion. The words settled over me like cold fog. I stared at the table, remembering holiday dinners full of laughter when I was younger, remembering how my dad looked at me when I told him I wanted architecture instead of law, remembering the Christmas night I was thrown out. Now those memories twisted into something darker. Rachel reached across the table and touched the back of my hand. She said I was in the middle of something very serious and that I needed to understand the scale before making any decisions. She asked if I had spoken to anyone in the firm about what I found. I shook my head. She nodded in approval. She said that the next steps had to be cautious because if the people involved realized someone was reviewing their actions, they might destroy evidence. For a while, we sat quietly. I felt the adrenaline that had kept me steady begin to drain, leaving me tired and unsteady. I asked Rachel what she advised. She said her instinct was to make a report to the appropriate authorities, perhaps a state agency that monitored legal and corporate ethics. She started to list departments and regulatory bodies. I listened, but part of me drifted into memory. I saw the face of my dad the night I was disowned. I heard his voice telling me that I had embarrassed the family. I remembered Madison watching from the stairs, silent and expressionless. Something inside me clenched at the thought of turning all of this over to strangers before I understood the truth. Rachel noticed my hesitation. She asked if I was reconsidering. I told her that I did not want my dad thrown into scandal by outsiders. I told her that if anything came crashing down, I needed to see it happen with my own eyes. She sat back and studied me with an expression somewhere between concern and understanding. She said she knew me well enough to understand that I needed closure as much as justice. She said she would not pressure me to report anything yet. Instead, she told me to keep every document safe and to trust nobody inside the architecture firm until I knew exactly what was happening. She reminded me that identity misuse could ruin my life if it went unchallenged. She said I needed to protect myself above everything else. She asked me to let her make copies of the documents for safekeeping. I nodded. While she worked, I tried to calm my nerves. When she finished, she slid the folder back to me and told me to keep going, one step at a time. I thanked her and headed out into the street. The night air had grown colder. People walked past carrying shopping bags and coffees, wrapped in scarves, laughing with friends, living their normal, uncomplicated lives. I stood on the corner for a moment, letting the crowd wash around me. My mind flicked through dozens of possibilities, none of them comforting. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I took the long route home, walking through side streets where the city lights glowed faintly against the brick buildings and the shadows stretched wide across the sidewalks. The following morning, I went to work early, hoped the quiet office would help me think. When I sat at my desk, I found myself glancing around, as if expecting someone to confront me. Everything looked normal, though. People arrived with coffee, chatting lightly, settling into their chairs. Ben walked past my desk and paused to ask how things were going. I managed to smile and say I was fine. He tilted his head slightly, sensing something off, but he did not press. Later that afternoon, he approached again and asked if I had a moment. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had news. We stepped aside to an empty workstation. He told me that the company had received an invitation earlier that day. He said our firm had been asked to attend a retirement celebration for a prominent figure in the Philadelphia legal community. He explained that the senior architect had been invited but was traveling and, therefore, wanted someone else from the team to go to the firm's place. He said that the envelope had been addressed to the office, with no specific name, so management thought it would be good for a mid-level team member to attend. Then he added softly that the firm had decided to send me. I felt a jolt run through my chest. I asked why. He shrugged lightly and said that I had been doing excellent work and that it would be a good networking opportunity. I forced a smile and nodded. He waited for a reaction, but I had none to give. When he walked away, I stood frozen. I had not heard the name of the honoree, though. I asked Ben casually who the retirement celebration was for. He said it was for a respected legal professional named Richard Potter. For a moment, I felt as if the air had disappeared from the room. The edges of my vision pulsed. I steadied myself by placing a hand on the desk. My dad. Of all the firms in the city that could have invited Archer and Bloom, of all the events that could have arrived on that particular day, the realization struck with a strange mixture of shock and inevitability. It felt as if every piece of the puzzle was being pulled together by invisible hands, drawing me closer to something I could no longer avoid. I walked back to my desk slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. I sat down and stared at the email that contained the event details. It described a formal gathering to honor decades of service in the legal field. It listed the venue, the time, the dress code. It said nothing about the man who had once thrown me out into the snow. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, remembering the look on my dad's face as he watched me leave that night. I remembered thinking that I would never see him again. Now I was being asked to attend the most important event of his career without anyone at my firm knowing that he had once told me to never return. I opened my eyes again and stared at the screen. I felt fear, anger, curiosity, and something else I could not name. I knew that attending the retirement party might put me in the same room with the people who had twisted my identity into something they could use. I knew that the answers I needed were there, the truth that had been hidden behind slush funds and signatures and family lies was waiting just beyond that invitation. And I knew that when I walked into that room, nothing in my life would stay the same. I shut off my monitor and sat quietly in the fading office light, letting the weight of what was coming settle into my bones. The truth was no longer something distant or abstract. It was close. It was real. And I was walking straight toward it, whether I felt ready or not. I left the office that evening with my mind still tangled around the knowledge that my dad was hosting a retirement celebration and that Archer and Bloom had chosen me as the representative. The invitation itself had arrived earlier that morning inside a white envelope, with the name of our firm typed neatly at the top. No personal greeting, no indication that the sender knew who would receive it. Just a simple request for our attendance to honor a respected figure in the Philadelphia legal community. The office manager placed the envelope in the basket reserved for firm correspondence. When the senior architect opened it, she glanced at the embossed card inside and commented that it seemed like a worthwhile opportunity for networking. She was already scheduled to travel out of state for a site visit that week, so she told her assistant to select someone from the mid-level team to attend in her place. I did not know that conversation had even occurred until Ben walked over to my desk later with the card in his hand. He smiled as he told me that management had chosen me. He explained that I showed promise, and that this would be a great chance to meet potential clients. He meant nothing more than encouragement, but my heart stopped immediately when I read the name of the honoree at the top of the card. I felt the blood drain from my face. The smooth gold letters printed on crisp ivory paper spelled out the name. Richard Potter. My dad. Only a handful of people knew that name and what it meant to me, and none of them worked in this building. I looked up at Ben, who waited for a reaction he could not possibly interpret, and I forced a small smile. That moment was when everything began to shift. That was the true beginning of the confrontation I had avoided for years. Now, step into the quiet stillness of my apartment after leaving Rachel and Detective Harris. The details of that moment returned with sharp clarity. The retirement invitation sat on my table, folded neatly, almost innocent in appearance. It had been delivered by courier that morning, addressed to Archer and Bloom as a gesture of professional courtesy. My dad had been a client of the firm in earlier years, and apparently maintained friendly ties with architects across the city. None of my colleagues knew that sending that card to us also meant sending it to me, his estranged daughter. The irony felt both cruel and strangely fitting. I set my bag on the table and sat down heavily in the chair. The light above me flickered slightly before stabilizing. I looked at the invitation again and traced my fingertip along the embossed letters. Retirement celebration in honor of Richard Potter, hosted at the Hallcrest Ballroom on the north side of the city. Formal dress encouraged. Remarks at 8 in the evening. Reception to follow. I read it again and again, as if repetition might make the situation feel more real. I had been chosen simply by chance, or fate, or whatever force pulls threads together at the precise moment they need to tighten. My thoughts were interrupted by the memory of my meeting with Rachel earlier that day. The air in her office had been cool and steady, her presence a calm contrast to the storm in my chest. She had explained that the Department of Justice handled cases involving internal misappropriation inside legal entities. She had repeated this carefully, making sure I understood the gravity. I did. Perhaps too well. She had looked at me with the same firm focus she once used when studying case law in college. She told me that the $480,000 allocation was the kind of entry investigators flagged quickly. She said the sudden appearance of my signature on older paperwork only deepened the suspicion. She said that if I chose not to turn everything over to the authorities, immediately I must at least involve someone trustworthy to intervene the moment I needed help. She said she knew exactly the right person. Detective Samuel Harris. And so that afternoon, I met him. Now, as I sat alone in my apartment, I replayed our conversation in my mind. Detective Harris had the steady presence of someone who had witnessed the worst and the oddest aspects of white-collar crime. His eyes carried a quiet patience, the kind that came from listening to countless stories from people who never imagined themselves in the center of an investigation. He listened to mine with that same attention. He had asked me to recount everything. My relationship with my dad, the night he disowned me, the scholarship that saved my life, my work at Archer & Bloom, the audit assignment, and the chilling moment I discovered my name used in ways I never permitted. I remembered the way he kept his hands folded and nodded slowly as if assembling the facts piece by piece in his mind. He told me that identity misuse was far from unusual in financial crimes. He said family names were sometimes used to create false layers of approval, because outsiders rarely questioned internal signatures. He said if my dad had access to old documents bearing my handwriting, he could have used them without my consent. I felt a coldness spread across me when he said that. The idea that my dad might have rummaged through pieces of my past to fabricate a consultant role for me felt deeply personal. Almost like an invasion. More troubling was the possibility that he had involved Madison as well. The spreadsheet with her name beside the unexplained $480,000 transfer haunted me. I wondered if she had known what she was signing. I wondered if she had been misled or if she had been part of something she believed served our dad. I wanted to believe she was innocent, but it was hard to forget the silent way she watched me leave that Christmas night, offering no resistance, no comfort. Nothing at all. Detective Harris had repeated that these were serious matters. He had reminded me that bringing everything to the authorities immediately would protect, but he also acknowledged the personal side of what I was facing. When he learned that I had not seen my dad in years, his expression softened slightly. He understood the emotional weight of this. He even said, in calm, steady words, that choices like mine were never easy. When he asked what outcome I wanted, I knew the answer even before I spoke it. I wanted my dad to see the consequences of his actions. I wanted him to look at me and understand that the daughter he threw away has become the woman who would reveal what he tried to hide. I wanted to watch his carefully constructed world crack. Not in a courthouse, not in a private office, but in the room he filled with friends, colleagues, and admirers. I wanted him to fall in the place where he had planned to be celebrated. It was not vengeance. It was clear. I needed to see the truth in his eyes before everything unfolded. So I told the detective that I would attend the retirement party. I told him I wanted him to wait outside until I contacted him. He gave a small, firm nod. He said he and one colleague would remain near the venue. He said they would not act until I made the call. He said that when the moment came, he would step inside and handle everything. Now, alone in my apartment with the invitation in my hand, I stood, walked to the kitchen counter, and pulled the documents from my bag. I spread them carefully on the table. The forged signatures, the spreadsheets, the approvals bearing my name, the copies Rachel had made. I organized each piece with slow, precise movements, feeling both fragile and fierce. The truth was there, in ink, in numbers. I gathered the documents into a clean folder for myself, then tucked the second set into my bag for the detective. I paused for a moment, letting my hands rest on the smooth surface of the folder. The next day at work passed in a blur. I moved through tasks almost mechanically, keeping my attention divided between the files on my screen and the growing anticipation inside my chest. Then noticed I was quiet, but he did not press. He simply asked if I was prepared for the event. I nodded. My voice remained calm, but I felt the tremor beneath it. When evening approached, I left the office early to give myself time to prepare. The air outside was cool, the sky painted in soft blue streaks as the sun dipped lower. I walked home slowly, absorbing the stillness in the moments ahead. Inside my apartment, I laid my clothes out once again. I chose a dark dress that fit neatly and simply. My hair I pulled back smoothly. My hands shook slightly as I applied light makeup, just enough to look polished, but not dramatic. I returned to the invitation, reading the details one last time. Hallcrest Ballroom, north side of Philadelphia, 8 in the evening. A celebration of legacy and excellence in the legal profession. I almost laughed at the irony. Legacy, excellence, words my dad used to worship, words he believed belonged to him alone. I checked the time. It was nearly 1 hour before the event. I picked up my phone and dialed the number Detective Harris had given me. When he answered, I told him I was leaving soon. He said he and his colleague were already positioned nearby. He instructed me to call him from inside the venue when I was ready. His voice was steady and reassuring. It gave me a small sense of grounding. I hung up and gathered my things. The folder of documents slid neatly into my bag. My hands lingered on the zipper for a moment before closing it. I stood straight, smoothing the front of my dress, and took a deep breath. There was no turning back. I knew that. Every step I had taken since the night I slept in my car had led me here. Every struggle, every rejection, every moment of rebuilding myself had prepared me for this night. I turned off the lights and stepped into the hallway. The building was quiet, the air faintly cool against my skin. I walked down the stairs with slow, measured steps, feeling the gravity of each one. Outside, the night had settled fully. Streetlights glowed against the pavement. A light breeze stirred the leaves of the trees lining the sidewalk. I started walking toward the subway station, the city humming softly around me. With each step, the weight of the past and the promise of the truth moved in tandem inside me. I knew that once I walked through the doors of the Hallcrest Ballroom, everything would shift. I reached the station entrance and paused for a moment, gripping the strap of my bag. The retirement party awaited, and so did the end of the life my dad believed he controlled. I walked down the steps of the subway station and felt the faint rumble of an approaching train beneath my feet. The city lights shimmered across puddles on the sidewalk, reflections stretching like thin ribbons of gold toward my shoes. My bag felt heavier with every step. Inside it were the documents that carried the weight of my past, my family, and every truth they tried to bury. The air tasted cold, almost metallic, as if the night itself sensed what was coming. The train arrived with a quiet screech and a gust of air that brushed against my face. I stepped inside and took a seat near the window. As the train began to move, the darkness outside blurred into long streaks of light. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed, trying to calm the restless beat of my heart. The retirement party was only minutes away now. Each moment pulled me closer to a confrontation I had avoided for 5 years. When the train reached my stop in Old City, I stepped onto the platform and walked toward the exit with slow, deliberate steps. The Hallcrest Ballroom stood only a few blocks away, tucked inside a historic brick building with tall arched windows and soft yellow lights glowing from within. As I approached, I could hear faint music drifting through the glass. Laughter spilled into the night each time the doorman opened the entrance for arriving guests. For a brief moment, I stood at the curb and stared at the large wooden doors. People in formal clothing walked past me, their conversations lively, unaware of the storm waiting quietly in my chest. I straightened my posture, lifted my chin, and stepped toward the entrance. The doorman welcomed me with a polite nod, unaware that my pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with soft lights reflecting off polished floors. Guests stood in small clusters wearing expensive suits and elegant dresses. Servers moved elegantly through the crowd carrying silver trays of sparkling drinks. Above it all hung large chandeliers that filled the room with a warm glow. It looked like a celebration meant to honor the kind of man who wanted the world to see only his perfection. My dad thrived in places like this, surrounded by admiration, pretending his image was built on integrity rather than intimidation. I took one slow breath and stepped further in. I had not been in the room for more than 10 seconds when I felt the shift in the air. It was subtle at first, like a current that changed direction. Then I saw their faces. My dad was standing near the center of the room talking with several colleagues. My mom stood at his side, smiling politely. Madison was only a few feet away, speaking with another attorney. The moment they saw me, all three froze in place. The shock hit them like a physical force. I watched the expression drain from my dad's face before he masked it with a tight, controlled smile. His eyes stayed locked onto mine for a long moment. I felt nothing but a cool, hollow calm settle over me. My mom blinked twice, as if she could not trust what she was seeing. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered something under her breath. Madison looked like she had swallowed ice water. Her eyes darted from me to our dad, then back to me again. Every emotion they tried to hide erupted instantly in their expressions. Fear, guilt, panic, and something else I recognized instantly. The terror of exposure, the terror of truth. It all made perfect sense. For 5 years, they had told everyone that I left the family willingly. They had said I ran away with a man who ruined my life. They had said I refused to speak to them. They had said they missed me desperately and that I had broken their hearts. I knew this because I had heard the whispers from distant relatives and old acquaintances. I had seen sympathetic messages sent to my social media pages from people I barely remembered, asking if I was safe. They had built a story in which they were the victims and I was the ungrateful. Runaway. Seeing me walk into the ballroom wearing a calm expression threatened the entire fiction they created. If I stood in front of their colleagues and revealed the truth, the entire narrative would collapse. The story they told about me would vanish, and the one they were hiding about themselves would rise in its place. That was only the beginning of their fear. My dad had another reason to panic. He did not know how much I had discovered, but the possibility alone would terrify him. If I knew about the documents he signed under my name, he risked exposure not only in this room, but in the courts he had worked in for decades. If I had evidence about the missing $480,000, it could tear apart the firm he helped build. His entire career could unravel in a single evening. The man who had spent his life preserving his reputation above everything else was suddenly trapped between walls that were closing in. Madison had her own fear. If I knew about the paperwork she signed, the one that connected her name to that suspicious allocation, her life could be shattered. Even if she had signed it without understanding, the optics alone would ruin her. She depended on our dad for her career, her status, her identity. If I exposed the truth, her entire future would fall apart. My mom carried a different kind of fear, the fear of being seen for what she truly was, the silent bystander. The woman who stood in the hallway on Christmas night while her husband dragged their daughter out of the house and abandoned her in the snow. The woman who watched everything but said nothing. She feared the judgment that would follow if anyone learned the truth. She feared the moment her years of silence could no longer be hidden behind polite smiles and designer dresses. And now, here I am, standing in the middle of their stage, calm, composed, a living threat to every lie they built. The room around us continued moving. People laughed, glasses clinked, music played softly, and waiters carried trays across the floor. But in the space between my family and me, everything tightened like the moment before a storm shatters the quiet. My dad recovered first. He lifted his chin, straightened his shoulders, and began walking toward me with that same authoritative stride he used in courtrooms. I remained perfectly still, my hands folded lightly in front of me. I could feel dozens of eyes beginning to drift our way, curious about the subtle tension they sensed, but did not understand. Before he reached me, someone else stepped into my path. Mark Wilson. He was one of my dad's longtime business partners, a tall man with gray hair and a reputation for being both charming and calculating. He greeted me with a warm smile, clearly unaware of the history unfolding between us. He looked at me with curiosity, noting the way my dad was approaching with such intensity. Then he glanced back at me and raised an eyebrow slightly. He said the words slowly, with a hint of amusement, as if observing a puzzle. "You know him." There was something in his tone that suggested he had already guessed there was more to this moment than simple recognition among colleagues. He was not asking for information. He was asking for the story beneath the surface. I felt every muscle in my body settle into a calm, steady stillness. My voice was soft, but carried enough strength to slice through the noise around us. Way too well. Mark stared at me for a second, his expression shifting as if something clicked unexpectedly in his mind. In that brief moment, I saw his entire understanding of the situation deepen. He looked from me to my dad, then back to me, realizing there was a layer of truth none of them had prepared for. Behind him, my dad stopped walking. His face tightened, and for the first time that evening, I saw something I had not seen since then. That night, he disowned me. Fear. Not anger, not disappointment, not control, pure fear. I breathed slowly and lifted my chin a little higher. My heart is steady now. The night had only just begun, and the storm I carried was finally ready to break open. And in that suspended moment, surrounded by polished chandeliers and soft music, I knew that my dad understood exactly what was coming. That was when the room began to shift around us. The room seemed to tighten around us the moment the words left my mouth. Day too well. It was not loud, not sharp, not aggressive, but it carried enough weight to silence the air between me and my dad. Mark Wilson glanced from my face to his with widening eyes as if he had stumbled into the middle of a conversation he had never imagined existed. He looked at me curiously, then at my dad with a new level of scrutiny. My dad's expression shifted in small, controlled movements across his face. His eyes narrowed with an attempt at authority, but there was a thin crack in his composure that anyone paying attention could see. His shoulders stiffened as he stepped closer, his jaw tightening in a way I remembered well. He always clenched his teeth before trying to regain control of a situation. I watched him try to gather himself just enough to appear calm in front of his colleagues. But his eyes gave him away. There was panic just beneath the surface. Mark stepped slightly to the side, giving us room but not quite leaving. He was too interested now, too aware that something in the room had changed. My dad leaned in just enough so only I could hear him. He urged me to move with him toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. His voice was soft but strained, carrying an underlying warning. I could hear what he meant, even without direct quotes. He was telling me not to create a scene. I did not move. I kept my posture tall and still, my chin lifted just slightly, my gaze fixed on him with an unbroken calm. Inside, I felt the years of silence I had swallowed. The nights I cried alone in my car, the humiliation of being thrown out in the snow, the ache of knowing my name had been used on documents that could ruin me. All of that built a quiet strength inside me. My hands remained steady at my sides. I leaned closer and spoke with a voice so low that only he could hear me. I asked him softly if he was afraid that the truth would be spoken in front of people who respected him. His eyes widened. For a brief second, I saw pure fear flicker across them. Before he could answer, Madison appeared suddenly at his side. She moved quickly, almost stumbling in her heels as she reached for my arm. Her hand shook as she touched me, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected someone to be watching. She whispered urgently, begging me to step outside with her. She looked terrified, like a child waiting for something to explode. Her panic made something inside me easier. It confirmed something I had suspected for days now. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. I pulled my arm gently out of her grasp. She tried again, her voice shaking as she pleaded for me to come outside with her. She kept glancing toward my dad, toward Mark, toward the guests who were beginning to look in our direction. Her breath was unsteady. Her face had lost its color. Then my mom approached. She moved slowly, her dress brushing lightly against the floor, her eyes already filled with dread. She stood between us like someone trying to stop a fire from spreading. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. She asked me not to do this here. Not tonight. There was a tremble in her words that came not from anger, but from fear. Not tonight. The words hung in the air like a thin thread ready to snap, and Mark heard them. He stood only a few feet away. I saw his eyebrows lift slightly, his head tilting just enough to show he had caught every syllable. He watched my mom, then my dad, then me. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to something far more serious. Skepticism, suspicion, awareness. It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. He had just discovered something important, something he was not supposed to hear. My dad noticed Mark watching us and straightened immediately. He tried to force a smile onto his face, but it did not reach his eyes. A sheen of sweat appeared at his temple. He attempted to move toward Mark, probably to brush off the moment as a misunderstanding, but Mark did not step back. His gaze stayed locked on us. He asked casually, in that smooth voice of his, if everything was all right. He directed the question toward my dad, not me. Another small but telling detail. Mark already sensed that the story belonged to my dad, not to me. My dad assured him, using calm, measured gestures, that everything was fine. He said it with the forced confidence of a man who had spent his life performing professionalism. But his voice trembled on the last word. Mark did not reply. He simply nodded once. Slowly, his expression tightening with something like concern or calculation. He stepped a few inches closer, as if assessing us from a new angle. My mom reached for my hand, gently, hesitantly, almost as if afraid I might pull away. Her fingers were cold. Her eyes were wide, filled with guilt and fear. She whispered again, asking me to leave the ballroom with her. She pleaded softly, telling me she could explain everything if I would just come outside. But I stayed still. Every part of my body was calm, steady, grounded. I had spent 5 years rebuilding myself from the ashes my dad left behind. I had learned to walk into buildings alone, pay my own bills, design structures that would stand long after I was gone. I had learned to hold my ground, and this was the moment all of that strength had been waiting for. I looked at Madison. Her eyes were shiny with unshed tears. Her voice broke as she said my name. She confessed quietly that she did not want me to be here right now. She said she was scared. She said everything was complicated. She said I did not understand. Her words stumbled over each other, frantic and terrified. I realized then that she had been carrying guilt of her own. The paperwork she signed, the fear she had been living with, the secret she had been forced to keep. For the first time in years, I saw her not just as the golden child, but as someone drowning in something she never anticipated. She had always depended on our dad to protect her, to guide her, but now she was caught in something bigger than both of us. My dad stepped closer again. He wanted to pull me away from the crowd. He insisted softly that we talk privately. He emphasized that the retirement party was not the place for difficult conversations. He said the same thing I had heard him say to countless people throughout my quick childhood. Always with that authoritative tone. Not now. This is not appropriate. We will discuss this later. But I raised my head and looked directly into his eyes. I saw his facade begin to crumble. The polished mask that had kept his reputation spotless for decades was slipping. A man who always believed he controlled every room was losing control right in front of his colleagues. Behind him, I watched Mark shift slightly, as though becoming more alert. He was watching, not just with his eyes, but with decades of legal instinct. He knew my dad well. He had worked beside him for years. And yet, in this moment, he was seeing something unfamiliar, something flawed, something dangerous, something hidden. The silence between us grew heavy. Guests around us sensed the tension, though none of them stepped closer. They simply watched out of the corners of their eyes, pretending to sip their drinks, pretending not to stare. Conversations faltered. Laughter faded. The quiet hum of polite celebration softened just enough that I could hear the faint music echo through the high ceilings. My mom squeezed my hand again, harder this time, desperate, pleading. "Not tonight," she had said. "Not here. Not like this." But it was too late. Mark had heard the plea, and the tone behind it told him everything he needed to know. That something was being hidden, that the family was afraid, that the story they had told the world for 5 years might not be the truth at all. I turned my gaze toward Mark for a brief moment. His face held an expression I recognized instantly. Calculation, analysis, suspicion. He was piecing things together, and what he was discovering did not align with the man he thought he knew. My dad tried once more to pull the situation back under control. He urged me again, more firmly, to follow him. His voice tightened, his face flushed with frustration. He reminded me in that tense, measured tone that family matters should remain private. Family matters. The words hit me with a bitter clarity. The night he disowned me, he had thrown me into the snow and shut the door behind me. That was his idea of family matters. Silence and control and reputation. And now, with a ballroom full of colleagues watching, he wanted to pretend we belonged to the same family again. He wanted to pretend we shared a private relationship built on mutual respect, instead of humiliation and abandonment. I lifted my chin. I spoke to him with quiet, steady strength. I told him that privacy was a luxury he had forfeited years ago. I told him that the truth had already begun to break through the story he built. And I told him, very softly, that I was not afraid anymore. Before he could answer, another ripple of movement in the room drew both our eyes. Mark stepped closer. His expression had sharpened. His posture had straightened. He looked at my dad with something like disbelief and dawning understanding. And in that instant, I knew that everything my dad feared was already happening. Because Mark Wilson, one of the most respected attorneys in the state, had just realized that something was deeply wrong, and the cracks in the truth were spreading fast. My dad noticed the shift in the room, and his breath caught slightly. His eyes flicked from Mark to me, then to Madison and my mom, then back to me again. For the first time in my life, I saw him truly cornered. The man who had controlled every narrative, every room, every conversation was losing control with every passing second. I did not move. I stood still and held his gaze. Around us, the ballroom lights shimmered softly, and the music continued to play as if nothing unusual was happening. But I could feel the tension tightening like a cord ready to snap. My dad opened his mouth to speak again, perhaps to beg or command or threaten. I could not tell, but before he could, another voice in the room called out his name, and the moment hung suspended in the air, thick with the promise that everything was about to break open. The sound of my dad's name being called drifted through the room like a ripple pushing against an already tense surface. He turned slowly toward the stage, shoulders stiff, trying to gather whatever composure he had left. Guests applauded politely as an event organizer gestured for him to come forward. My dad released a controlled breath, straightened his jacket, and made his way toward the center of the ballroom. Each step he took felt like it pulled the room tighter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I watched him as he climbed the few steps up to the platform where a microphone waited. The chandeliers cast a soft light across his face, highlighting the practiced smile he forced onto it. I recognized that smile. It was the same one he used in courtrooms, at family gatherings, and during every moment, he wanted the world to see him as respectable and honorable. It was a mask he perfected long before I ever learned what masks were. He reached the podium and rested his hands on its edges. The room quieted. Music faded. Conversations ended. Guests turned their attention toward him with admiration and expectation. It was the moment he had been waiting for, perhaps for years, a celebration of his career, a culmination of his reputation, a spotlight crafted specifically for him. He began speaking in a warm, confident tone. He told the audience how honored he was to stand before them. He thanked colleagues, mentors, and partners. He reflected on decades of legal work, victories in courtrooms, clients he had helped, cases he had shaped. His voice carried across the ballroom with a polished rhythm that came from years of training and ego. Applause followed his pauses. Guests nodded approvingly. Then his speech shifted. He spoke about the importance of home. He told the audience that the foundation of his success was built on family. He called family everything. He said that behind every strong leader stood the people who believed in them. My stomach tightened as I listened to him paint a picture so far from the truth that it almost felt unreal. He said he had been blessed with 2 perfect daughters, I felt the words strike the air like a blade. He described them as brilliant, loyal, and beautiful. He spoke of fatherhood, as if it were the greatest honor of his life. He used phrases about love and unity, about sacrifice, about guiding the next generation. His voice softened whenever he mentioned his daughters. People in the audience smiled warmly, unaware of the reality behind those sentimental lines. They saw a man expressing gratitude and affection. They had no idea that those words were crafted to protect his image, not reflect his truth. As he continued, he lowered his gaze slightly, but not enough to meet mine. He scanned the room, but avoided the section where I stood. I could see the tension in his neck, the tight pull of nerves behind his composed expression. He knew I was watching. He knew I heard every word, and he knew that each line he spoke stretched the fragile fabric of his performance thinner. He spoke about overcoming adversity. He spoke about loyalty. He spoke about integrity. And all the while, my mom sat at a table near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders trembling just slightly. Madison stared down at her glass, unable to lift her eyes toward him. Mark Wilson looked between my dad and me with a growing intensity in his gaze. My dad's speech drifted toward its close. He thanked the audience for their support over the years. He raised his hand slightly, as if offering one final gesture of appreciation. The crowd applauded loudly. People stood. Some even whistled. It was a celebration of a man they believed had earned every bit of admiration. But I did not clap. I held his gaze, even though he tried desperately not to meet mine. I let my silence stand in place of applause, a cold, steady stare that cut through every lie he had spoken. He stepped away from the podium, smiling tightly as he shook hands with a few colleagues. As he came down the steps, his eyes flickered toward me. The moment our eyes met, the mask cracked again. I saw fear. I saw guilt. I saw the foundation beneath him beginning to crumble. Before he could speak or reach me, Mark Wilson approached quickly. He reached my side with the look of someone who had spent the last several minutes assembling pieces of a puzzle that were never supposed to be revealed. His voice was low and strained as he addressed me. He asked if I knew my dad. The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of suspicion and shock. It was not a curiosity anymore. It was disbelief. I turned toward him, my blood steady, my breathing calm. I told him in a firm and even tone that I believed I knew my dad, and I added that he had no idea how I knew him. Mark's eyes widened. His jaw tightened. He looked at me with an expression that shifted quickly from confusion to concern to something sharper. I had known he was perceptive, but I had not expected him to grasp the seriousness this quickly. My dad stepped toward us, trying to intercept. His face turned slightly desperate, his smile forced. He attempted to get closer, but Mark placed a gentle but firm hand near his own chest, stopping him without touching him. The gesture was subtle, yet loud in its intent. It told my dad that Mark wanted answers before polite applause turned into uneasy whispers. I reached into my bag slowly, feeling the smooth edge of my phone beneath my fingers. I looked at my dad as I did so. His face was drained of color. I recognized that expression too. It was the look of a man watching his lies unravel faster than he could gather them. I lifted my phone without breaking eye contact. This is it, I thought. One call. The one call he never expected me to make. The one call that would end the years of silence he had built his empire upon. The one call that would erase the lies he told about me. The one call that would expose the documents he signed under my name. The one call that would force him to stand in front of the consequences he created. I pressed the number Detective Harris had given me. He answered immediately. I heard only his breath. I spoke quietly, telling him that the time had come. He replied with a simple confirmation that he and his team would move. I hung up. I set my phone down in my bag. My hands did not shake. My heart did not race. Everything inside me felt like still water. Calm, steady, ready. My dad watched me with a look of disbelief, fear, and anger swirling in his eyes. He stepped closer. He asked me what I had done. His words were quiet but sharp, almost frantic. My mom rose from her seat, her face pale. Madison's hand trembled as she reached for her clutch. The guests around us began to sense that something was happening. Conversations dimmed. Heads turned. The soft hum of celebration faded into a quiet murmur. My dad asked me again what I had done. I simply looked at him and waited. 10 minutes passed. 10 long minutes in which the room teetered between festivity and tension, between celebration and unraveling. My dad tried to keep moving, greeting guests, shaking hands, pretending nothing unusual was happening. But his eyes never left me. He kept glancing back as if expecting disaster to erupt at any moment. He fumbled over words when colleagues congratulated him. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked over his shoulder at every sound. Then the ballroom doors opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The crowd fell silent. Behind them walked Detective Harris and another investigator. Their presence cut through the room like a cold wind. Guests parted instinctively, giving them space. Eyes widened. Hands tightened around glasses. Conversations died instantly. The officers paused near the entrance, scanning the crowd. Detective Harris walked deeper into the room with slow, deliberate steps, his badge clipped to his belt. His partner followed. They moved with the quiet authority of people who had done this many times. People who were here for something very specific. Someone very specific. My dad stiffened where he stood. His face turned a stark shade of white. I saw the exact moment he understood that his past had finally caught up with him, and that I was the one who brought it to the door. The room remained frozen in shocked silence as Detective Harris approached, and I stood still, waiting for the truth to finish breaking open. Detective Harris stepped closer, stopping only a few feet from my dad. The ballroom was silent now, hundreds of eyes fixed on him, on me, on the scene unfolding, like a slow unraveling of every lie my dad ever crafted. The music had stopped completely. Even the servers stood frozen near the walls, their trays held carefully in their hands, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment. My dad swallowed hard. His hands twitched at his sides. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the desperate attempt to find an escape route, a loophole, some performance that might save him. But there was no courtroom here. No judge to charm, no jury to sway, only the truth standing in front of him. Detective Harris spoke in a calm voice, asking if they could speak privately outside. My dad tried to put on a smile, a friendly nod, a light-hearted gesture, as if this were some minor misunderstanding. He said something about being happy to help with any concern, but his voice cracked. His throat tightened. Guests exchanged looks. Mark Wilson's eyes narrowed. The detective said they would prefer to discuss everything at the station. A ripple of shock spread through the room. My dad looked around, panic darting across his face. He said he did not see why that was necessary. He tried to laugh. He insisted that tonight was supposed to be a celebration. He insisted that any conversation could wait until later. He insisted that he had done nothing wrong. Detective Harris held his ground, saying firmly that this was not optional. My dad's shoulders slumped. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Not the towering figure who dominated every room he entered. Not the authority who dictated my future, my choices, my worth. He looked like a man who finally understood that the consequences he had, outrun for years, were now waiting just outside the door. The detective gestured gently. My dad hesitated, then stepped forward, as though dragged by invisible hands. Mark Wilson approached quickly. Confusion and betrayal etched across his face. He asked my dad if any of this was true. He asked what Detective Harris was talking about. He asked why certain files he had recently seen looked altered. He asked why a signature he did not recognize matched one from the architectural documents he had received. His questions spilled out faster than he could contain them. My dad had no answers, or rather, he had no lies that could hold their shape anymore. He mumbled something about a misunderstanding. He said he would explain everything later. He reached toward Mark in a plea, but Mark stepped back sharply, shaking his head. His disappointment cut deeper than anger. My mom moved toward the officers now, her eyes wide and her hands trembling. She tried to speak. She tried to ask if this was necessary. She tried to claim there had been a mistake, but her voice was barely audible, swallowed by the room. She turned toward me then, and something inside her cracked. The years of silence, the lies, the complicity, the fear, the loyalty to a man who destroyed his own child. It all rushed to the surface and washed her voice away. Madison stepped out from behind her, her entire body shaking. Her face was pale. Her breath was rapid. She whispered something to Detective Harris, something barely formed. He leaned closer, listening as she spoke in a rush of guilt and fear. She told him that she had signed things she did not understand. She told him that she had been told it was routine. She told him that she trusted him because he was her dad. She told him she never meant to approve anything illegal. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted that she had let him guide her signature wherever he wanted it. It was the first honest thing she had said in years. The detective nodded, asked her to accompany another officer to provide a more detailed statement. Madison nodded, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. She did not look at me. She did not have the strength yet. My mom sank into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face. She began to shake silently. Her shoulders rose and fell with each breath she could not control. Guilt crushed her. The years of watching my dad tear me apart, the years of standing by, the years of pretending. She whispered something into her hands. I could not make it out, but her grief filled the space between us like a long-awaited confession. Guest whispered now, shock turning into murmurs, and murmurs turning into questions. People who had thought of my dad as a pillar of ethics felt the ground shift beneath them. Eyes darted from him to me and back. Some looked horrified. Some are confused. Some betrayed. Some are sympathetic. The ballroom was no longer a celebration. It was a reckoning. The officers positioned themselves beside my dad. They did not handcuff him here. They simply instructed him to walk with them. He hesitated, trying to salvage some part of his dignity. He straightened his jacket again, lifted his chin, and then took a step toward the exit. I stepped into his path. He froze. For the first time since Christmas night, when I was 23 years old, he looked directly into my eyes without trying to dominate or dismiss me. Behind him, cameras flashed from guests who wanted to capture everything. Dozens of witnesses held their breath. I leaned in just enough that only he could hear me. I told him today I am the one walking away. His face flinched. Something inside him crumpled. He tried to speak, but the words did not come out. He walked toward the doors, escorted by the officers, the click of their shoes echoing across the ballroom floor. He crossed the threshold into the hallway, then toward the elevators, disappearing slowly from view. The room remained silent for a long moment. No one clapped. No one spoke. No one dared to pretend that anything could return to normal. Eventually, I turned and walked through the crowd. People parted instinctively, giving me space. I felt eyes following me. But no one stepped forward to stop me or question me. Not even my mom. Not even Madison, who was now seated with an officer as she provided more details with a broken voice. I left the ballroom quietly, slipping into the cool night air outside. The sky above Old City shimmered dark blue, scattered with lights from buildings and street lamps. I walked without any real direction, letting the cold wind brush against my face until my steps carried me toward the river. By the time I reached the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, the city around me had quieted. Cars passed occasionally, but the night belonged mostly to the steady hum of the water below and the glow of Philadelphia stretching out in both directions. I stood at the railing, looking out across the skyline. The lights reflected off the river like scattered sparks. For a long time, I simply breathed, slow, deep breaths that filled my lungs with the kind of air I had not felt in years. Air free of fear. Air free of shame. Air free of the weight my dad had pressed onto my shoulders since childhood. I thought of the girl sleeping in a cold sedan in West Philly. The girl who hid her sketchbooks under her coat. The girl who convinced herself she was nothing because someone who should have loved her taught her to believe it. I thought of the years I spent trying to earn approval that was never meant for me. The silence I endured. The lies told about me, the pain that pushed me into the life I rebuilt piece by piece. And now, standing above the river with the city lights on my skin, I felt something I had not felt in such a long time. Freedom. Not the kind that comes with revenge, but the kind that comes with release. The knowledge that the truth had done what I could not. The knowledge that I no longer carried the burden of their choices. The knowledge that my life was finally my own. I rested both hands on the railing, and watched the river move beneath me. Slow and steady, my future stretched out somewhere beyond the skyline, waiting with new pages I had not yet touched. And for the first time, I felt ready to step into it without looking back. If you have ever been told that you were too much or not enough for your own family, if you have ever carried wounds that were not yours to carry, I hope you know what I learned tonight. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest form of justice you will ever speak. Tell me what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. I want to hear your stories too.